My question is about women in Matthew's genealogy. Bathsheba. I am wondering if there is any significance to her name being called Bathsheba in 1 Chronicles 3. It reminds me of Judah's wife, Shua, from 1 Chronicles 2. So I wonder if there's more to the reference since Tamar is mentioned in Matthew's genealogy and not Shua. The thing I am impressed by this connection is the lack of a seed from Judah's sons by Shua, except for Shelah, who fathers sons in 1 Chronicles 4, who are described as the house of linen workers at Beth Ashbea, which sounds and looks a lot like Bathsheba. Could this be one more thread tying the women in Matthew's genealogy together for some reason? 1 Chronicles 4:22 also mentions the grandsons of Judah, ruled in Moab, which could be a slight reference to Ruth as well. And we hear no more about Shelah's sons. So what is Matthew trying to show us? I see 4 women who have infidelity in common, but is there something else he is messaging?
Well, I mean, the short answer is, yeah, there is more to this. I'll give you, for the sake of this episode, I'll give some seed thoughts, but this is actually a chapter in my forthcoming book, Reversing Hermon, because there are things going on in the genealogy specifically with these women that again telegraph this idea that the one who will come, the Messiah, will again undo, the effects of the transgression of the Watchers, the Enochian story of Genesis 6. And you think, what does that have to do with the women? Well, that's what the chapter is about. And the chapter is based on a recent dissertation from Marquette. Again, I'll just give the seed thoughts here, because there are some things in that draw these women together. So I think it's appropriate again to mention Ruth, and of course Bathsheba and whatnot. So I'll just read you a bit of an excerpt. That's probably the easiest way to do this from the new book. So we have here the reference to Tamar. Okay, Tamar or Tamar is the first of the 4 women in Matthew's genealogy. That's Matthew chapter 1, of course. And she's known primarily from Genesis 38. Now, the questioner gave a reference to Judah, in Chronicles, but that's hearkening. That's a flashback to Genesis 38, where Tamar deceives Judah, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, into an illicit sexual encounter. We need to recount the story here so that the connection, again, to what would be what I call in the book the Watcher template, is decipherable. But before I quote that, all of these women have, again, some sort of sexual transgression element involved in their story, either something done to them or something they do, something, again, just in their backstory that is supposed to, as I argue in the book, supposed to draw our attention to the theme of sexual transgression. And then there are things in the text as well that take our minds back in terms of specific vocabulary words back to the episode of Genesis 6:1-4. But I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts of that here, but let's just go to Genesis 38 just so people can sort of get the context. Genesis 38, starting in the first verse. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adulamite, whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua. If we skip to verse 12, in the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, in other words, this Canaanite woman, died. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shears, he and his friend Hira the Adulamite. And when Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, then she took off her widow's garments, covered herself with a veil, and she dresses up like a prostitute. Well, in the verses that we didn't read, and then some of the backstory, Tamar, was the one that had lost a succession of husbands. And the last of Judah's sons, was sort of next in line because of the whole custom of the levirate marriage. And Judah had withheld him from her. And again, it's not just a sexual thing. It's for the purposes of having children, which is tied to inheritance of property and all that kind of stuff. So he has withheld his last son from her because the other ones have died after being married to this woman. Well, to Tamar. So, when Judah's own wife dies, and has a period of mourning, then he goes up to, this, this particular place where the sheep shearers were, and Tamar hears this, and she goes, "Okay, I'm gonna get revenge. Essentially, I'm gonna trick him." She dresses up like a prostitute, seduces her own father-in-law, and then of course she gets pregnant by that. We know, or at least I'm assuming we know the rest of the story. How she eventually gets vindicated, and he's shown to, have basically betrayed, the thing he should have done was to give her his son, and so on and so forth. So we have this whole incident that revolves around this Canaanite woman who was the daughter of Shua. She was Bat, the daughter, okay, of Shua, Bat Shua. So, keep that in mind, because that the terminology is going to come up again, and it already did in the question. Now, Bathsheba's name becomes part of this because in 2 Samuel 11, where readers first encounter her, she's called, quote, Bathsheba, Bat-Sheva, the daughter of Eliam. In 1 Chronicles 3:5, she's given a different name. She's called Bat-Shua, the daughter of Amiel. And in Hebrew, the first part of the name, Bat, okay, it means daughter. So the name from 1 Chronicles literally is just like the situation back in Genesis 38. It means daughter of Shua, which is, the part of the passage we just read. Now, this whole, issue with Bat Shua connecting Judah's situation where this woman in question was a Canaanite, we're not told specifically if Tamar was a Canaanite, but the woman Judah had married was a Canaanite. She's the daughter of Shua. And then we get this going on with Bathsheba, of course, and who gets involved with David. It's because of this that it's possible, scholars have theorized, that Bathsheba was a Gentile, and was a Canaanite, so that Uriah and Bathsheba were not a mixed couple, a Jew and a Gentile, but they were both Gentiles. And the connection back to Tamar is interesting, again, for the purposes that I deal with in that particular chapter. Because if that's the case, and the issue is not so much that these women are Gentiles. We can't prove that all of these women were Gentiles. There are some that for sure are, and there are others that are, you can make an argument, a sort of a peripheral argument like this one, for the possibility anyway. But the real issue is that, not only are they potentially, at least two of them, but maybe all four of them, sort of another seed, okay, outside the Israelites, that whole idea. But they definitely, all four of them, have something in their background that has to do with an illicit sexual relationship. And that becomes, again, part of the backstory, and in some cases part of their redemption. In other cases, it's peripheral to them, and someone else, has to have that problem taken care of, and they were victims, that sort of thing. But as I'm going to argue in this chapter of the new book, all of these women are connected by the theme of sexual transgression. And they are, I'll just give you one example. Like Ruth is called a Gevirah, which is the feminine equivalent of Gibor, which is a term that comes from Genesis 6:4. The Nephilim are called Giborim. That doesn't mean anything in terms of her literal physical genealogy. It's just a term that people would have picked up on, that would have taken their minds back to the Genesis 6:1 through 4 incident, connecting something in Ruth's heritage, in her story, and Boaz is a Gibor as well. That there are things going on here that connect their backstory to these 4 verses in Genesis. And you say, well, why does that matter? Well, it matters because this idea that it was because of the sexual transgression of the Watchers that they came to earth, and they not only, again, just sort of had this heaven and earth transgression, but they also taught humans how to basically destroy themselves through different points of knowledge. And there are things about, let's say, one of the things in Enoch that's mentioned is makeup and perfumes and all this stuff. Well, by themselves, you could look at that and say, well, big deal. Well, those things are often mentioned in biblical stories to portray a seduction incident. Okay, and so that takes the reader's mind again back to, again, this theme of sexual transgression, which sort of gets its kickstart in Genesis 6:1 through 4, or at least the blame for that kind of behavior is laid at the feet of this incident. You know, that becomes the wellspring, the bad wellspring from which people, you know, just go crazy. Again, they take something that in and of itself could be neutral. And some of the things that the watchers, you know, are, you know, quote unquote, you know, teach humans are in other passages, in certain passages, neutral, but they can also lend themselves to destructive behavior and self-destructive behavior. And that's why in Jewish thinking, part of the, again, if we back to our old question, if you ask the average Christian, why is the world the way it is? Why is there so much sin and evil? The only answer you're going to get is Genesis 3. If you asked a first century Jew the same question, they would not say Genesis 3, the fall. They would say that's one element. The other element is Genesis 6:1 through 4. And the third, you know, element to that is what happened at Babel. So all three of those things frame depravity for a first century Jew, whereas Christians are taught to only think of one of them and exclude the other two. Well, the New Testament writers don't exclude the other two. And so the expectation of the Messiah in between the Testaments and, again, in certain things said in the New Testament, certain episodes, draws on this idea that the Messiah is supposed to be the cure for all of this garbage, all of this depravity that springs from these three incidents, not just this one. And so I don't want to go too much further than that, because I really can't do the terminology and the naming issue justice in this, you know, brief description. But at least those are sort of the nuggets, you know. But this is a good catch on the part of the questioner, and it's something that again, Hebrew readers would have noticed. And then the question, you know, comes, well, why is it there, and what is the writer trying to intentionally draw attention to? And as we'll see in Reversing Hermon, oftentimes it's this episode, this second segment of the three causes for why the Messiah needed to come.